As I was researching various scenarios, I realized just how incredibly lucky the Habsburgs were to roughly remain territorially stable from 1700 to their eventual demise. There were so many opportunities to cause the fall of the Austrian Habsburgs. Today, we're going to be exploring most of those moments and how exactly they would damage the Habsburgs. Considering we're going to be exploring 7 scenarios here, we won't go into detail on them. If you really want to see one of these made into a full scenario, then comment that one below. Now of course, we can start our stories really early. We could very easily, in the early centuries, just eliminate the dynasty altogether, or weaken them to never rise to a position of prominence, becoming just a random German noble family. Personally, this route doesn't interest me too much. So, to narrow our scope, we will start in 1618 with the 30 Years' War, at which point the Habsburgs were already solidified as the Emperor of the HRE, with a rivalry with France and the Ottomans, and a dynastic partnership with Spain. Also important, this video will specifically focus on the Austrian Habsburg, leaving Spain for another day. So let's just dive right in with the 30 Years' War. Most of you will know the rough context. Austria was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and as such, they were expected to fight for the Catholic faith. And arguably, Emperor Matthias took this role a bit too seriously. He heavily crushed the Protestants in Smyrna, while in the wider German Empire, the heresy was becoming more and more popular amongst German nobles, as it allowed the Protestant princes to consolidate their own wealth and power and assert their autonomy from the emperor. This rise of Protestantism had a huge potential to devastate the Habsburg Empire. Now, we're not going to delve into extreme detail, as across 30 years, this war included, at various points, all European great powers and most of the key German states. The conclusion of the war in our timeline already didn't quite favor the Habsburgs. France expanded, Sweden and Brandenburg consolidated power, while the Dutch, as well as the Swiss, officially left the empire, and generally, Austria's influence over what was left was greatly reduced. Yet, especially at the start, things could have been far worse. Now obviously, there are a lot of variations in how things could have been worse in this war, so we will only focus on one of the absolute worst cases. Despite Austria's fervent Catholicism, they suffered from a lot of Protestant popularity across their realm, especially because Emperor Matthias was so violently anti-Protestant. This Protestantism would soon be channeled into a clear anti-Habsburg sentiment. Conflict truly began when Protestant Bohemian nobles threw representatives of the crown out of a window. This soon saw Bohemia enter into open revolt against the Habsburgs, followed by Silesia and Upper Austria. This was a fundamental threat to the Austrians, as should Bohemia truly break away, this represented the loss of the wealthiest of their domains, while also losing Austria the crucial Bohemian vote for emperor, and very possibly shifting the balance of electors in favor of the Protestants. Yet, despite this terrible position Austria had found itself in, they would manage to defeat a Bohemian army outside of Vienna. And as the Bohemians attempted to consolidate their independence, they offered their crown to Frederick V of the Palatinate, a move which, it was hoped, would strengthen the Bohemian position and commit the Protestant Union to helping them. It did the exact opposite, as despite religious disagreements, many in the empire were still fearful in so openly contesting the emperor's legal right to Bohemia. This made foreign support within the empire completely flip, allowing the emperor to recover his kingdom. Had things gone differently, and perhaps the Protestants more openly supported Bohemia, things could swiftly deteriorate for Austria. Perhaps if Bohemia crowned one of their own nobles, rather than commit to a union with the Palatinate, their position could be stronger. Maybe they are just a bit luckier militarily speaking. However we do it, doesn't matter. Either way, if Bohemia consolidates independence at this stage, Austria has an issue. 4 of the electors are now Protestant, and conflict with Bohemia leaves Austria unable to respond to threats from France, Denmark, Sweden, and the Ottomans. It is very much not hard to imagine a world where Bohemia's independence cascades with the Ottoman conquest of Slovakia and perhaps the rest of Hungary. The Protestants could hold the emperorship hostage, requiring either great bribes to keep electing the Habsburgs, or perhaps even electing a totally different ruler to the position. The Austrian Habsburgs grow totally reliant on their Spanish cousins, but, as you know, this is the start of a terrible time for Spain too, as Louis XIV is soon to challenge them for European dominance. The very unity of the Holy Roman Empire could be lost, as there is no longer an emperor with enough power to keep the nobles in check, at least on paper, as we see nations like Sweden and Denmark pick at the north of the empire and France in the west. Weak and powerless, Vienna under direct threat by the Ottomans, Austria becomes little more than a pawn in the European game of power, the loss of Bohemia being the start for the end of Austria. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Yet, Austria survived this crisis. Yet mere decades later, we get the famed Ottoman Siege of Vienna. Within a few decades, in two instances, the Ottomans threatened to gain the Habsburg capital. Once in 1683, the one with the famed Polish Hussars, and one in 1664, where the Ottomans were prevented from reaching Vienna. Aside from subtle differences, the conclusion from an Ottoman victory in either of these wars is pretty much the same, though we will discuss it together with a greater focus on the much more important War of 1683. Now, as will become a theme across this video, it is the start of this conflict where Austria is truly at risk, with the famed Siege of Vienna. The emperor had already fled, supplies were low, yet Polish assistance removed the Ottomans just in time. As a result of the siege being lifted, the war was turned around on the Ottomans, eventually growing into a gigantic anti-Ottoman coalition. After 17 long years of war, the Ottomans, arguably for the first time ever, suffered a significant territorial defeat to the Christian powers. Yet, what if it hadn't? What if the Poles failed or refused to send aid? What if the Ottomans simply clutched out a victory in the Battle of Vienna? What if the Ottomans successfully gained the imperial capital? Obviously, there are some catastrophic consequences from this, but we shouldn't expect something too radical, like the Ottomans annexing all of Austria and preparing for hegemony in Central Europe. By this time, the Ottomans were starting to face some real fundamental issues, and such campaigns would almost certainly overstretch their forces. Not to mention, likely unifying most of Europe against the Turks. Yet, that doesn't mean that the peace treaty cannot still be devastating. At least all of Hungary is seized by the Turks or handed out to vassal rulers. Vienna itself was planned to be given to Hungary, but I could also imagine the Turks returning it to Vienna to secure peace, while immense financial demands would be placed on Austria. There is no doubt in my mind that Austria would survive this war, but that doesn't make their position any better. As in the West, we have French King Louis XIV, working tirelessly to improve his position at the expense of the Habsburgs. He would likely draw the line somewhere at the Ottoman conquest of Germany, but he would still welcome this Ottoman weakening of Vienna, to further his ambitions in Spain and the Low Countries. Just as crucially, the Ottomans have also prevented their historical defeat in the Great Turkish War. This could slow their territorial decline by decades. And once the Ottomans do start losing, Austria might not actually be in a position to benefit. Within the German Empire too, Austria's power could be greatly weakened. And while I don't want to focus too much on France, as we will focus on them in the next scenario, there is still a serious potential for them to consolidate control over Spain. Now caught between two far stronger powers, at a time when several German powers were coming into their own, I have little faith in the future of the Habsburgs. Next up, we have the War of the Spanish Succession. The kings of Spain had for centuries been Habsburg, and through these familial ties been close allies to the Habsburgs in Austria. Yet, before 1700, everyone knew that this was about to come to an end. Charles II, the iconic image of Habsburg inbreeding, was childless, and he had chosen Philip to be his successor. Issue? Philip was the grandson of Louis XIV. For all except France, this threatened to be a huge problem. But for Austria, it was by far the worst, as they were both losing an ally and seeing their rival strengthened massively. Now, while initially Philip V wasn't in the line of succession for France, in practice he was very much only a few deaths away from being king of both nations. If France gained all of Spain, their position in Italy and perhaps even Germany becomes nigh unstoppable for Austria. As such, Austria declared war to try and prevent this, but it didn't go quite as they hoped. Their allies were relatively far away, and Bavaria would join the French, seriously threatening a march on Vienna. Even worse, the Hungarian uprising was launched, creating yet another front line. If either France or Hungary seriously threatened Vienna here, this could very well have resulted in the surrender of the Habsburgs. Luckily for Austria, this fate was avoided in our timeline. Victory at the Battle of Blenheim and British-Dutch reinforcements arriving allowed Austria to consolidate Bavaria and consolidate Hungary again. While Austria did fail to prevent Philip becoming the King of Spain, they did regain the lowlands, Naples and Milan, thereby preventing France from becoming too powerful, and ensuring that they remained a great power after the war. But what if reinforcements were prevented, or France had simply won the Battle of Blenheim, after which they march on and threaten Vienna, forcing the Habsburgs to surrender? How might such a thing play out? Well, worst case, Hungary might cement their independence, already stripping huge territories away from Vienna, while minor territories might be stripped by Bavaria too. It's also possible that the treaty is lighter than that, because if they demand too much, the Habsburgs might just not surrender, or the war might even escalate. Yet even if we assume that Austria loses nothing, just the fact that they don't gain the lowlands or Italian territories creates a significantly worse position after the war. Best case, Austria is in trouble. Worst case, Austria is surrounded by hostile powers, all in a loose alliance with France. Either way, a loss in this war guarantees that the balance of power radically shifts against Vienna. But don't worry, it gets worse. As decades after the War of the Spanish Succession, we have the War of Austrian Succession. Feel free to combine what I'm about to say with the previous loss in the Spanish Succession or true disaster. Now, this war is a lot more direct in threatening the destruction of Austria, and the issue was very simple: sexism. Charles VI failed to get a male heir, so tried his best to secure the succession of his daughter. In doing so, he spent great resources to bribe and negotiate with all the other powers of Europe, while deprioritizing his army. Upon his death, he believed that he had succeeded. He was very wrong. Soon after, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony-Poland, France and Spain all revoked their prior support of Maria Theresa. Prussia would be the first to jump into action, making a daring move on Austrian Silesia. On paper, this was a war that Austria should be able to win. Yet Frederick the Great and Prussia's military reforms secured the advantage. Soon after, Bavaria and Saxony, followed by France, would join in the war as well. Charles had made the grave mistake of marrying his nieces, who each had a claim to Habsburg territories, to Saxony and Bavaria, giving them the perfect justification for war. Finally, Spain also joined the conflict, hoping to regain territories in Italy. Despite Austria securing an alliance with Britain, the situation was rough. In the end, three things would save the Habsburgs through the capable actions of Maria Theresa. The first was her rushing to secure the Hungarian part of her realm. As you will remember, last time Austria was in trouble, they had revolted. Should they do so now, Maria was doomed. Yet, through an impassioned speech, underpinning them as her last hope, their commitment to the crown was secured. The second advantage was von Khevenhüller, a very skilled general, managing to win several battles despite being heavily outnumbered. Arguably most important though were disagreements between the anti-Austrian forces. Prussia just wanted Silesia, but was not interested in letting Bavaria grow too powerful. Both Saxony and Bavaria claimed the same territories, while France didn't really care too much about the outcome, as long as in some way the Habsburgs were weakened. Had the coalitions figured out these issues before the war, they had a real shot at success. Yet now, Austria managed to divide and conquer. Prussia would leave the war at various points. Saxony would grow disinterested when it became clear that France preferred Bavaria, while Bavaria itself would eventually get occupied. Austria made it out very light, only losing Silesia and minor Italian territory. But yet again, had in those crucial early days of the war, Hungary revolted, or battles just didn't go in Austria's way, or if the coalition had simply coordinated better, then we could very easily imagine total disaster befalling the Habsburgs. In the worst cases, we might see a total partition of Austrian holdings by France, Spain, and Prussia, while losing Bohemia, if not more, to Bavaria, as King Charles VII of Bavaria even takes the emperorship from the Austrians. Of course, this would be an extreme version of events, but it is really not that far-fetched to imagine the Habsburgs being reduced to just a middling power through this conflict. The next one then is arguably the vaguest, as it's the Napoleonic Wars. For this one, I don't think there is a specific moment where Austria could have collapsed, but just the period in itself was a huge risk for the Habsburgs, as in every conceivable direction the French could expand into, it threatens Austria. Austria would lose several wars against the French, causing the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, severely weakening their prestige and influence, evicting them from Italy, annexing the Low Countries and up to the Rhine, puppeting Germany, as well as stripping Tyrol and the entire Austrian coast from them. In our timeline, the coalition eventually got a grip on France, but it is very clear that in any world where Napoleon wins, that only leaves narrow paths open for Austria to prosper. Beyond that, had Napoleon so chosen, he had various opportunities to more permanently deal with the Austrians, crippling them yet further. He didn't do this in our timeline, as he preferred to use the Habsburgs to increase his legitimacy and to keep them around in the post-war world. Yet if he hadn't, whatever remained of Austria would undoubtedly play a far smaller role in the coalition's eventual victory, leaving Austria unlikely to end up in as strong of a position post-war. But Austria does survive the storm that is Napoleon, yet what seems like an initially strong position, being the puppet master of Germany and Italy, soon turns out to be a disaster, as Austria doesn't just have to contend with the liberal ideals popularized by Napoleon, but also the growing forces of nationalism. Apart from Austria, nobody likes this current position. The Germans want a united Germany, the Italians want a united Italy, and the Hungarians want an independent Hungary. All of these desires were aimed directly at the Habsburgs. And then, a wave of revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, arguably hitting Austria the hardest out of any European state. Von Metternich, one of the most powerful men in Europe for decades, was fired, while the monarch abdicated, but most importantly, revolts in Italy caused a war with Sardinia-Piedmont, the Hungarians rose up, while the Prussians very publicly tried undermining Austria's position in Germany as the German Confederation collapsed. Once more, this situation was an existential threat to Austria. While they got Italy under control relatively fast, Hungary became a complete mess, which Austria struggled to contain by themselves, as eventually a huge Russian intervention was required to get the region under control again. There is a debate on whether Austria could have eventually won this war themselves, but even if they could, it would have required far greater effort, leaving them bankrupted afterward. Then, against Prussia, Austria likewise called upon Russian help to restore the German Confederation. By the end, little actually changed, yet things could have gone way worse for Austria. Hungary could have in some form broken away. Power over Italy could have been lost. Most states in Germany had agreed to become part of a Prussian-dominated proto-empire called the Erfurt Union. After Hungary's independence, Best case scenario, Austria continues to struggle for dominance over Germany, retaining Slovakia and Croatia despite losing Hungary and defeating Sardinia. In worst cases, power over Germany is lost, leaving Prussia the only option for those states. Hungary could have broken away fully, and Sardinia-Piedmont could have consolidated power in Italy. In either of these cases, the future of Austria looks very bleak. This then leads us to arguably the least terrible scenario of the day. The period of 1866 to 1868, when both Italian and German unification was being decided upon at the expense of Austria, of course. Bismarck was positioning Prussia for a conclusive war, while the newly unified Italy sought to gain at least Venice, but preferably significantly more. When war broke out, nobody seemed willing to support the Austrians, and Prussia and Italy's decisive victories greatly shocked the state. Not only was Venice lost and power in Germany destroyed, Austria was forced to practically give Hungary independence, as due to the recent conflicts, government finances were on the brink of collapse, and a new Hungarian revolt could have broken the nation. All of this was already pretty bad, but it could have been worse. Had Italy performed better in the war, for example, they could have very much imposed greater demands on Austria. More notably, Bismarck, wisely, prevented territorial demands on Austria. Yet, many within Prussia did suggest taking territories. An extreme and unrealistic proposal had Prussia annex Bohemia and Austria, but more sane proposals ranged from Austrian Silesia to the northern Sudetenland to all of Bohemia. Such proposals would not only weaken Austria, but also threaten to destroy the odds of a future alliance with Germany. It is arguably the tamest of the scenarios discussed today, but still, potentially a far worse timeline for Austria. Now finally, we have the conflict that actually destroyed the Habsburgs, World War I. I won't spend all too long here, as we know it actually did destroy Austria. Yet I still wanted to give a mention to this, as the total destruction of Austria isn't necessarily the only way for it to go. By 1914, the empire, while still stable, was in my opinion one huge crisis away from collapse. Yes, we know World War I did it in our timeline, but even a more minor defeat, concentrated likely around Bosnia, could have been enough to rock the state significantly. Most notably, as the Hungarian portion of the empire might have the potential to move towards further independence, while the Germans within the empire might jump on the crisis with pro-German sentiment. For as long as the status quo persisted, the Habsburg Empire worked perfectly fine, but any significant crisis does have the power to destroy it. Best case, by seeing Hungary fully secede, worst case, by total collapse, both of which would be terrible for the Habsburg Empire. For now though, that concludes this video. If you enjoyed this type of video, let me know in the comments and suggest what other nation I might give this kind of treatment to. As always, consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing, and click the video on top to watch another in this series. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.